Hello, and welcome back to Chapter 9 of the Assassination Simulation. I hope you enjoy. Chapter 9. You don't understand. You didn't see what he did, Evie pleaded at Hat as they walked into their room. She winced at the defensiveness in her voice, but couldn't stop the words from pouring out of her mouth. Hat opened his mouth, his expression guarded, but Evie didn't let him speak. He kicked Lubanzi's throat in. If we were back on Earth, I think he would have killed him. I had to do something, Hat. I couldn't let this keep happening. I did what I needed to do to make sure this never happens again. Evie. And he'll be okay. 2 minutes in a resurrection chamber will undo everything I did. Really, I just scared him. I couldn't keep watching him hurting Lubanzi. Evie, shut up. I get it. Hat shouted, cutting off her flood of words. You don't need to explain it to me. I know what's been going on, and I saw what he did to Lubanzi. I went to the medbay with Amaya when we heard there was an incident. You're right. You didn't technically do anything wrong, and Haruto will be physically back to normal within the hour. Evie stared at the pigeon. She was breathing heavily, and to her surprise, suddenly found herself fighting back tears. She collapsed onto her bed as relief hit her like a wave, making her realize just how worried she had been. Not about Haruto, about Hat's opinion of her. Look, Evie, I understand why you did what you did. In fact, I would bet that Claro, or one of the other Scanarians, egged you on. Hat paused, and Evie, thinking back to Claro's words, gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. She didn't think she would have started the confrontation without her trainer's encouragement. I understand, Evie, but that doesn't mean I think what you did was right. Hat hopped down from her shoulder to her knee, spinning in an awkward circle so he could look directly up at her. There is something I need to explain to you. A mistake that a lot of assassins make. You need to understand what it's like to live in the understanding. Are you old enough to remember when the internet became a thing back on Earth? Evie blinked at the abrupt change of subject. Yes, she responded, confused. Good. Think back to what it was like in the beginning. It was this revolutionary new technology, destined to change the shape of the Earth forever. And it did. It connected the entire world and made an astronomical amount of information accessible to anyone who took the time to look for it. Evie stared at the bird, unsure what he was trying to say. But how long did it take before humans got used to it? Before the internet lost its novelty and became just an everyday tool? The same thing happens when a species joins the understanding. Hat walked forward and climbed onto her hand, and she lifted him up to eye level. At first, when it's new, it's amazing. No more loss, no more suffering, not on the same scale. But after a few decades, it becomes the new normal. People forget what their old lives were like and start taking everything new for granted. Violence loses its meaning because it no longer has consequences that touch the members of the understanding directly. Over time, they turned it into a game that they watched on a screen. Nothing but entertainment. Hat leaned forward. His little eyes stared directly into hers, making sure she was listening. You can't make that mistake, Evie. For one thing, you're not watching from the sidelines. You're right in the thick of it. If you start picking fights just because there aren't consequences, you're going to get yourself killed. But more importantly, you can't let them convince you that this shit doesn't matter, that it's normal, hell, even fun, to hurt another living thing. You're not a character in a video game. You're a person who will have to live with your actions for the rest of your hopefully long life. Haruto, in a lot of ways, is just like you. He has his own demons, and the fact that he's a rat bastard doesn't justify what you did to him. It doesn't matter that what you did is reversible. You can't let yourself get comfortable with that level of violence. Evie looked down, unable to hold the bird's intent gaze any longer. A knock on the doorframe caused her to look up. She jumped to her feet as Lubanzi and Amaya entered. Lubanzi was back to normal, with no hint of his horrible injury remaining. His eyes, normally so open and friendly, looked warily at Evie. I saw what you did, Lubanzi said, his voice clipped. They brought Haruto in right as I came out of the resurrection pod. Amaya told me the details. Evie, what the actual fuck? Evie flinched backwards on the bed. She had never seen Lubanzi angry before. "How could you do something like that, Evie?" Lubanzi yelled. "That's what Haruto does. He hurts others. Just because you hurt him this time doesn't suddenly make it fucking okay." "I was trying to protect you," she said, her voice quiet and pleading. "To protect both of us. I know I shouldn't have done it, but there's nothing I can do about that now. But Lubanzi, can't you see? He won't bother us anymore." Lubanzi's hands flew up in an angry gesture. "I don't need you to fight my battles for me, Evie. Maybe you've forgotten, but in a few months we'll both be dumped alone onto Honrad. You won't be around, and if I can't handle my own shit, I'm going to be dead. Haruto is a bully, but compared to what's coming, he's a warm-up. I need to learn how to deal with things like him myself, even if that means he's going to break my neck every other day from now until we land. You didn't help me by taking that away." Evie winced, Lubanzi's words striking her like a slap in the face. All she had wanted to do was protect him, but he was right. She wouldn't be there to protect him on Honrad. She hung her head, no longer able to look at him. After a moment, she felt him take a seat next to her on the bed. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. She felt his hand on her shoulder and looked up. His face had softened. "I know it can't have been fun to see what he did to me. I would have been devastated if our positions were reversed. But what you did to him was worse." "I know," she whispered. "I can see that now. But in the moment, there's so much anger inside of me. When I let it out, I hurt people. There's something wrong with me." "Well, no shit," Hat said. His voice had returned to its normal, irreverent tone. "There's something wrong with all of you. You have to be your own special flavor of fucked up to end up here. We won't hold it against you. Just promise to at least try to remember this conversation next time you feel like literally ripping off Haruto's balls. You can't do anything about how you feel, but you can choose not to act on it." Evie reached up, placing her hand on top of Lubanzi's and squeezing. Amaya, to her surprise, hopped onto their hands and gave her thumb a gentle nibble before speaking. "We forgive you, Evie. Just please learn from this. They are trying to make you a weapon. Don't let them reduce you to that." Long after Lubanzi and Amaya had left, and Hat had drifted asleep, Evie lay awake. Their words spun in circles around her head. She understood what Hat had been trying to say. He knew that she would have to embrace the use of violence as a tool, but didn't want her to grow too comfortable with it. She wanted to agree with him, but a small portion of her couldn't deny how good what she had done to Haruto had felt in the moment. Her anger was a part of her, no matter how much she tried to ignore it, and embracing it, even for a moment, had been liberating. This was the perfect venue to explore that part of herself without consequences. It might even make her a stronger candidate in the sim. But should she? Evie rolled over, squeezing her eyes shut and willing sleep to overtake her. Evie's eyes opened with the light and the alarm tone. Hat's morning grumbling came to an abrupt end as they both remembered what day it was. Today was the weapons ceremony. The last few days had been uneventful, much to everyone's relief, and there had been no more sparring matches or competitions between the three assassins. Haruto, on the surface, seemed normal, but Evie could tell he was avoiding them. This morning, there would be no training. Myra arrived with breakfast, a simple protein shake, before whisking Evie away to get ready. She escorted Evie and Hat to a distant room that Evie had never been to. As they entered, Hat announced that he would see her later, and was off, flying away down the hall before she could say anything. Myra, unconcerned, ushered Evie into the room. It was a kind of dressing chamber, with a large attached bath off to one side. With no additional preamble, Myra escorted Evie to the bath and told her to undress. Over the past months, the Scanarians had slowly eroded away Evie's modesty, and by this point, her nakedness did not bother her. Mostly. She was irrationally grateful that Hat had remained outside. Myra pushed Evie into the bath and scrubbed her to within an inch of her life. After she was clean, the preparations began. Myra sat Evie, wrapped in a towel, down in a chair. She ran a brush through her hair, getting out the worst of the knots before leaving it to dry. Then she started on Evie's skin. For the next few hours, Myra delicately painted a pattern across Evie's shoulders and down her arms, stopping at her elbows. For most of the process, Evie couldn't see what she was painting. Any time she tried to look, Myra would snap at her to sit still. But as the woman made her way down Evie's arm, her work slowly came into focus. Using a shimmering paint that was only a shade or two lighter than Evie's skin tone, she was painstakingly outlining thousands of tiny scales. They were subtle, but glowed as the light hit them. After what felt like an eternity, Myra abruptly finished and left the room. She returned a few minutes later with a dress. The garment was a pearl white ball gown, clearly influenced by human formal wear. It had no sleeves and a high neckline, supported by a tight-fitting collar. Evie felt her stomach clench uncomfortably when she saw the fabric close up. It looked like the flayed skin of a Scanarian, and Evie fervently hoped it was synthetic. Myra removed the towel wrapped around Evie, opened the collar, and helped her step into the dress. She carefully maneuvered the garment around the areas she had so painstakingly painted, fastened the collar, and stood back. The wall in front of them shifted, and Evie found herself face to face with her own reflection. Suddenly, she couldn't breathe. The gown hugged her so perfectly she felt naked, cinching in her waist and flaring out at her hips to give her curves that she had never had. The scales painted across her glistened like small ornaments in the light, emphasizing the muscles in her arms. She had never looked more like her sister, and had to shut her eyes against the tears that threatened to fall from them. "If you're finished admiring yourself, Evie, we should get going. Azur is meeting you, and we don't want to be late," Myra said, guiding her towards the door. Hat sat just outside, perched on a small white branch that had sprouted from the wall. His feathers glistened, and she wondered if he had also gotten a bath. He eyed her up and down for a moment, then fluttered to his customary spot on her shoulder as Myra led them down the hall. "No wonder you took so goddamn long. What's with the fancy get-up? And where's your mask?" he whispered into her ear. "What do you mean?" she responded, confused. "They didn't give me a mask." "This kind of crap normally gets pulled out at the end of the sim, in the ceremony where the top-rated assassins get their boons," he whispered, gesturing with a wing at her dress. "Normally, assassins just wear their uniforms to the weapons ceremony. The only thing you actually need is your mask. She didn't give you a mask?" He shot a suspicious look over at Myra, as if it might be her mistake. "Azur wanted to hand out masks in person before the ceremony," Myra said over her shoulder. "I know it's a little unusual, but Azur said that since there's so much excitement around this crop of replacements, a little extra flair was justified. Don't blame me." Hat and Evie glanced at each other in confusion. The three walked for a few minutes, arriving at another room that Evie hadn't been to before. Myra ushered her in before turning around and heading back down the hall. It looked like a small conference room and had a door set into the back wall. Not a doorway, an actual door. It was only the second that Evie had seen since setting foot on the ship. Lubanzi and Haruto were already there, accompanied by their producers. Both men stood awkwardly on separate sides of the room. They wore formal vests and pants, made from the same fabric as Evie's dress. Their bare arms also shimmered with subtle scales that blended into their different skin tones. Unfortunately, the sleeveless formal wear worn by the two men evoked a different, presumably unintended image. Evie coughed into her hand to stop herself from bursting into laughter. The two men looked like male strippers. "Don't say anything," growled Lubanzi, his dark skin standing out sharply against the white clothing. "You look..." Lubanzi eyed her up and down, an eyebrow raised. "Intimidating," he finally settled on. "You look great," Evie replied, fighting hard to keep her face straight. "Are those pants held on with Velcro?" Hat stifled a giggle. "Shut the fuck up," Lubanzi snarled, blushing. "No, really," Evie was trying and failing to keep her voice neutral. "If assassinating aliens doesn't work out, you've got a promising backup career. I hear Chippendales is hiring." Lubanzi gave her a dirty look, but she could tell his heart wasn't in it. Suddenly, she noticed that his dark skin was paler than normal, coated with a light sheen of sweat. As Evie opened her mouth to ask if he was okay, a familiar voice at the doorway cut her off. "Well, would you look at you? You clean up nicely, Evie." Azur glided in. It was the first time they had seen her in over a month. She wore an extravagant, shimmering silver uniform, and delicate chains were wrapped around her neck and wrists. Her scales glowed as if waxed, and her large golden eyes fixed on Evie. Over the last few months, Evie had become used to the Scanarian's wide, toothy smiles, but Azur's still unsettled her. Behind Azur, 2 more Scanarians filed in. The first held a stack of 3 medium-sized boxes. The second brandished a tablet, and sitting on his shoulder was another pigeon. Hat snickered uncontrollably, unable to stifle his mirth. The new pigeon threw him a dirty look. It was wearing a tiny, ridiculously poofy white coat. "That's a Scanarian pigeon," Hat whispered into Evie's ear. "The poor bastards are used to Scanarian temperatures." "I wanted to give you 3 your masks in person," Azur said, finally acknowledging the other 2 humans by waving them forward. They stopped awkwardly behind Evie, to either side of her. Azur stepped forward, spun around, and wrapped an arm around Evie's waist, turning her slightly so that the 2 of them faced the Scanarian with the pigeon. Small, black flecks darted around them, and Evie realized the pigeon was filming. The Scanarian quickly jotted notes on his tablet, and she guessed he was some kind of reporter. "Evie, as you know, your participation has generated a lot of excitement," Azur spoke. She looked at Evie, but her voice was loud and addressed the reporter. "With your unconventional weapon and your background, we're all looking forward to seeing what you can do." They stood for a moment, frozen in place, as Azur smiled for the cameras. Evie, unsure what to do, kept her face neutral. The second Scanarian strode forward, taking the top box from the pile and handing it to Azur. Azur let go of Evie's waist and accepted the package, nudging Evie to turn so that the 2 stood facing each other. Azur reached down and removed what looked like a white porcelain mask from the box. It was the same mask that Evie had seen worn by the other human assassins. A white, androgynous face with a neutral expression and no holes for eyes, nose, or mouth. "Evie, this mask is the mark of a Scanarian assassin, and I am honored to be the one to put it on you. Wear it with pride, and don't forget what it means. We expect great things from you." Evie had no idea what the mask meant, but decided this was not the time for questions. Azur reached up and placed the mask on Evie's face. The inside shifted and slid along her skin. It was unsettling, and Evie had to grit her teeth to keep herself from crying out as the mask contorted itself around her face. After a tense moment, she could see and breathe normally again. The mask moved with her as she opened and closed her mouth, not restricting her facial movements. She looked at Azur, who again stood, poised, looking triumphantly down at Evie. A small, glowing tag appeared in Evie's vision. It read, "Azur, Director of the Scanarian branch of the Assassination simulation." She glanced at the other 2 Scanarians, but no more labels appeared. After a moment, the reporter spoke. "Miss, did you want to mask the other 2? Azur hesitated, then shrugged indifferently. Within a minute, Lubanzi and Haruto both wore their masks as well. They did not receive the same speech and fanfare that Evie had. For the millionth time, Evie wondered why such a big deal was being made about her participation. The reporter, following a gesture from Azur, walked to the back of the room and exited through the door. Evie glimpsed a large chamber on the other side, full of murmuring voices, before the door shut and hid the room from her view. Azur had followed the reporter to the door, but hadn't gone through. Instead, she turned to face the 3 humans. "I was supposed to brief you all on what's going to happen during the weapons ceremony, but it slipped my mind. Honestly, you really don't need details, just follow directions. When the time comes, I'm going to lead the way into the auditorium." She gestured through the door at the back of the room. "When directed, you will follow." The Scanarian who had been holding the boxes stepped forward, smiling. "Go where we tell you to go and try and look dangerous and mysterious. After you receive your weapon, see if you can improvise a flourish or something, then exit the stage back to this room." She looked from Evie to the other 2, but no one said anything. Evie was incredibly grateful to Vor for breaking the rules and giving them details ahead of time. She would hate to be going into this blind. With a small twinge of her conscience, she wondered if anyone had talked to Haruto. Evie glanced at Lubanzi. The blank, expressionless eyes of his mask looked back at her. It was disturbing, and Evie quickly looked away. "Try to relax," Hat whispered in her ear. "You look like a sexy sleep paralysis demon. They'll be more scared of you than you are of them." Evie smiled weakly, though she knew the expression wouldn't be visible through the mask. Haruto had lined up behind Azur by the door at the back of the room. Evie made to follow, but stopped when Lubanzi grabbed her wrist. "Evie," he said. His voice was clear, not muffled by the mask at all, but so quiet she could barely hear him. His fingers were trembling and squeezed so tightly it was painful. "Please, don't think too badly of me." She stared up at him, wishing she could see his eyes beneath the mask. Then he released her and gestured for her to get in line behind Haruto. At some unseen signal, Azur exited through the doorway. A minute later, the remaining Skinarian gestured for them to follow. Holding her head up high, Evie followed Haruto through the door into the weapons ceremony.